Hi everybody, Adam Steele here, and today I'm going to be looking at what I think is basically magic. This is the XFilter 500 from Elysia. So, full disclosure, Elysia sent this over for me to try and hopefully for me to keep. They are people that I met while I was in France. They're a German company, but I happened to meet the CEO of Elysia, and he's really a clever kind of guy and really kind of enthusiastic and a proper nerd, which really speaks to kind of me. Hi, nerd. And we got talking, and so Ruben and me said, yeah, we should definitely do something together. And so the first thing that I'm doing for Elysia, hopefully there'll be more in future, is tell you all about the XFilter 500, which is an EQ. So it's like, oh, whoop-de-doo, an EQ. But it's a really, really high spec EQ. They do this in a 500 series. They also do it as a separate rack unit if you're not a big fan of 500. But the idea is the same. I mean, these are the kind of guys that make super high-end stuff. They mill their own knobs for everything, you know, they do everything in-house. And this is a big stereo EQ. So it's got, there's a 500 series, two of the kind of connectors at the back that are separate from each other. But each one of these knobs affects the entire stereo field. So everything is stereo controlled and stereo matched. So there's not going to be any kind of weird mismatching going on. Really useful in applications like mastering. That's the main thing I'm going to do today, is I'm going to show you using a graph on the plugin doctor what this does in terms of its EQ curves. And then we're going to go ahead and take a track of mine, which in hindsight, as it was released, could have sounded better. The mix was okay, but the master wasn't quite there. And the tone from this should bring me right to where I wanted it to be. So this is a stereo 4-band EQ with an extra fifth function that is probably my favourite part of this whole unit. So it's got low and high shelves, which can be set to be cuts instead if you want to roll off the top or the bottom of a signal. Really particularly useful for something like a heavy guitar kind of thing. You could have a guitar bus going through this, a high cut, I don't know, 10k, 8k, whatever works for you. And then use the high mid to kind of boost kind of in that presence area, etc, etc. It's got two mid bands which have selectable frequencies, and also they're either a wide Q, which is very musical, or a narrow Q, which is more specific. And then there's the passive function. They call it passive massage. I call it flipping magic. It's like the passive, so let's start with the passive massage. Alright, so I have plugin doctor running, and it's going out of two outputs on the Arturia Audio Fuse 8 Pre, in, and then back out straight into the converters on the Audient ASP880. And as you can see from the graph, it's pretty much ruler flat. There's a tiny little 0.2 dB drop off around 20k, and it starts to tail off below 20 Hz, which are both numbers I don't really care about. Pretty much every mix that I ever do, everything's shelled off below 20 Hz anyway, and when we're getting up into the super top range, that's to be expected, that's not a problem. So from this flat ruler response, I turn it on, we get a little spike, and then we get almost exactly the same. There's a tiny little bit like I think it's 0.2 dB bump in the middle, half a dB of extra mids. As far as kind of flat goes, I think I can live with that, because what I'm going to do now is cause it to go absolutely bananas. I'm going to press the passive massage button and watch what happens. Get that big high frequency lift. I say big, it's about 3 dB, and then it sharply drops off. So by the time we get to 20 kilohertz, there's about 5 decibels gone, but it's a big passive bump below that. So it feels brighter, it feels like there's kind of a much more excited high end, and it doesn't mean that there's kind of really nasty frequencies up at the top. And because it's passive, it's not going to introduce any kind of ringing artifacts, which is really useful in that range. And we can see if I bring in the low shelf, I'm having to do this backwards by the way, because I'm kind of looking at the screen. I'm looking at a different screen to see this. But if I turn up the low shelf, we get a very big, very round kind of shape. And if I If I move the shelf, you can see that that's still a big shelf. I could have that all the way down at 20 Hz and still use it almost like a passive kind of shape. So I could use it to kind of bring in some real sub stuff. Or bring in some more of that kind of chest beaty kind of frequency. So let's flatten that off. Flatten off the passive mid-range. So then we've got high mid, which again, big round curves, unless I press the narrow Q button. If I press the narrow Q button, then we get a much more noticeable, which if you've got a particular range that isn't standing out in your mix or is too much, you can gently kind of notch that down. This is not a surgical device. This is very musical, I think is the term, even on the narrow stuff. Ah, yes, and on the low, we can turn it into a low cut, like I said earlier. But even with the low cut, the gain is more like a kind of a resonance control, and then we bring in the frequency. So I could do something like that, for instance, where I've got kind of a big 50 Hz bump, and there's not a lot below that, which might be really useful for something like a kick drum. To kind of sort out any rumble, but also give us a big thump on the low end. I might well do that on a kick drum and then print it like this so that I can reuse this on another source. And then we kind of repeat at the bottom. The low mid has its kind of narrow or not narrow. And the highs we can shelve in a very similar way. So I could say dip a high shelf a little bit by a couple of dB and use the passive massage to give me a kind of a tape style flavor without the saturation, if you will. And I could have a high cut. If I really push a resonance on a high cut. I could find somewhere around the 5 to 8K range and have that resonance so that on a heavy guitar, that would then bring out the brightness, but also remove anything above that, which is kind of useless frequencies. So then I could play around with the gain for the resonance to kind of lift that area in terms of brightness until it's right, but then above that be gone. So now you've seen it, let's hear it. So now, behind me, there is a track by the Decemberists that I worked on for an Audient video a while back, and that's now routed from the Arturia with this in the path and then straight back to the converters. So like we had Plugin Doctor before, but now you're going to hear it. And as I do things, you will hear it in real time as I press buttons. This might be something that you need to put headphones on for, especially the passive, because it's a very subtle thing on its own. It looks like a big sweep on Plugin Doctor, but 2 dB, 3 dB can be quite hard to pick out unless you're on the right listening system. And when I press the hit it button at the bottom, that turns the whole thing in and off and bypasses it in an analog way. So you'll be able to hear what I've done. So without further ado, watch, and here we go.
Witness to the arc towards the sun. The neighbor's blessed burden within reason becomes a burden born of all in one. And nobody knows. Let the yoke fall from our shoulders. Don't carry it all, don't carry it all. We are all our hands
Cool, so I was struggling a little bit there because I'm having to reach to the other side of this and watch in a camera what I'm doing, because filming is weird. But what I arrived at was just by kind of listening through. I started with the passive massage, which I like on almost everything unless it's a really bright source. Then the lows, instead of a shelf, I decided to use the cut, and it ended up around, what, 50, 60 hertz? With a big resonance so that there's more of a bump on the kick drum, but below that is filtered out. There's very little on the high mids. I used a narrow Q to take out what I ended up hearing was around 1K. There was a bit of a her kind of frequency. And there's a low, there's a high shelf, which again I was kind of toying with, didn't need much of. And the low mids I took a tiny bit out, around 200 hertz, again with a narrow Q. And as you could hear when I turned it off and turned it on, those little things made a big overall difference. And that's because it's perfectly stereo. And that is a great mastering tool. And because it's stepped, I can now write those frequencies down if I need to recall and bring them back exactly, because feeling for the steps there, really useful feature to have. So yeah, the XFilter 500, you're going to see this either in Studio B in my kind of mixing room, or back here for tracking. It might be kind of, I might have to bring it in between the two or try and get a second one, because this on Source is like that on a heavy guitar. While I'm tracking, I'll be able to do things like scoop the lows and the highs without being intrusive. That's going to be massively useful. Or using it on things like a snare on the way in to kind of beef up the low end. Using it on a vocal, again in place of something like a pull tech, I could use that passive massage and just gently scoop things so that it doesn't sound horrible going in, etc, etc. There's so much I could do with this, and it's just an EQ. Wait till we start talking about things that they do, like the transient stuff. And the compressors, like the alpha compressor that they do is like an 11 grand compressor. They're never going to send me one of those. But they do have like the X-presser and the N-presser, which I could talk about in the future. But yeah, these are available in links down in the description below. Massive thanks to Elysia for sending this over. This is going to see a lot of use. And yeah, thanks to Ruben and all the guys at Elysia for being awesome. Hopefully we'll be able to do a studio tour of Elysia at some point in the future. Keep your eyes peeled for that. Thanks everybody who's on Patreon, who supports us to keep the lights on and to be able to do this kind of thing. It really, really does mean a lot. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.